So Bali is a place that has for a long time been very popular amongst digital nomads and expats. There's a lot of great reasons to like Bali. I'm here right now and I have to tell you the lifestyle here is pretty great. Amazing gyms, healthy food, the party scene is good, you have the beach. But the big question is, can you live in Bali with zero tax or low taxes? So in this video I will cover what 99% of nomads in Bali do not consider about taxes in Bali and how you can potentially use Bali as part of your global lifestyle while still paying zero or very low taxes, but why it's probably not as easy as you think. So Bali overall is one of my favorite places. From a lifestyle perspective, I really love it. Now, as I've talked about in previous videos, from a business standpoint and from a work standpoint, there are certain sacrifices that you have to make, but no place is obviously perfect, and this is a place that I want to keep coming back to. But one thing about Bali and Indonesia, because Bali is in Indonesia, so really we're talking about Indonesian taxes here, is that unfortunately optimizing your tax situation in Bali and Indonesia is not quite as simple as in a lot of the other places that I talk about on this channel. So the thing about Bali is that it is very popular with the kind of expat and like digital nomads who aren't necessarily making that much money and who really just think like, well, maybe I should pay some tax, but they're not gonna find out, so I'm not gonna do anything. And obviously if you follow this channel, you know that that is not my approach at all. I always want to be legal. I always want to do everything exactly by the book. And my perspective is that if I'm not happy with the rules and with the deal that I'm getting in some place, I can just go somewhere else. There are places around the world where I can go and get the kind of financial situation that I want if I'm not happy with it in a given place like Bali, for example. So just to give an overview of how taxes work in Indonesia, unfortunately what Indonesia has is a worldwide taxation system. There's a lot of other countries in Southeast Asia that will have like a territorial tax system or a remittance-based tax system like Thailand has, for example. But in Indonesia, the tax system is largely quite similar to what you will find in a lot of Western countries, where if you're a tax resident, you're going to be paying Indonesian taxes on all of your income. Now, the tax rates aren't nearly as high as they are in Western countries, but they're not low either by any means. So that is the first reason why there's really much less you can do to optimize in Indonesia than in other countries around the region, like Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, Hong Kong. All these countries have more or less like territorial systems. And the second reason is that unfortunately also the tax residency criteria in Bali and in Indonesia are a lot more subjective than a lot of the other countries in the region. It's again a lot more similar to Western countries than the other developing countries in the region, where in a lot of other countries like in Thailand, for example, whether you're a tax resident or not is determined by a simple days test. I believe it's 180 days in Thailand. If you spend above that, you're a tax resident. If you spend below that, you're not a tax resident. In Indonesia, they also have a rule based on spending 183 days in the country. However, even if you don't spend these 183 days, you will still be considered a tax resident in Indonesia if you quote reside in Indonesia, which is again subjective, like what does that mean exactly? Or if you are present in Indonesia during a given tax year and you intend to reside in Indonesia, which is again very vague. So the key question with optimizing in Indonesia is how do you avoid triggering tax residence? Because if you do become a tax resident, there's very little you can do. There's one small exemption which we'll cover in a moment, but by and large, if you want to live a tax friendly lifestyle, you can use Bali and Indonesia as a base, but you absolutely as a first step want to avoid becoming a tax resident. So how do you do that? Well, first of all, even if you don't become a tax resident in Indonesia, by default or Indonesian sourced income will still be taxable in Indonesia. It's actually how it works in most countries. People just like conveniently ignore it. Now there's a way to essentially block Indonesia from taxing that Indonesian sourced income if you're a non-tax resident by using tax treaties. So this is where it becomes important to have a tax residence in some country in the world that has a tax treaty with Indonesia, because often these tax treaties, for example with the country where I am tax resident, the UAE, these tax treaties have a clause where it says that if a person is a tax resident only in one country in this treaty, in this case the UAE, then the other country, in this case Indonesia, will not be able to tax Indonesian sourced income unless it is performed for more than 6 months in any calendar year. So essentially, if you have a tax resident somewhere else in a country that has a tax treaty with Indonesia, you can spend up to 6 months in Indonesia and even perform work there, have Indonesian sourced income and not be taxable on it. And by the way, Indonesian sourced income means any income derived from work done while sitting in that country. This is nothing to do with where you have your bank account, where you have your company, although obviously whether they can enforce this is a whole another question. So that is if you're not an Indonesian tax resident. Now, how do you avoid becoming an Indonesian tax resident? Well, the first thing is obviously don't spend more than 6 months. The second thing is that even if you spend less than that, but you demonstrate intent to reside in Indonesia, they could still deem you a tax resident. So the key question here is, what do they in practice classify as demonstrating intent? Well, based on my understanding, and this is absolutely not tax advice, just based on my research, what seems to be the case is that if you obtain any kind of residence permit, so what they call a KITAS in Indonesia, that is in practice treated as you demonstrating intent to reside in Indonesia. So I personally almost obtained the remote worker KITAS, so the remote worker residence permit in Indonesia, designed for remote workers, because I figured, well, I'm going to be spending time here every single year, so I might as well get this residence permit. However, from what I found based on my online research is that if you do get this residence permit, you would actually become a tax resident in Indonesia. I don't know 100% if this is the case, but just to be safe, what I would do is just use one of the shorter term visas and not actually get a residence permit if you want to spend time here, just to be on the safe side. So that is the first thing. The second thing is you probably want to be a bit more careful about owning real estate, especially if you keep it empty when you're away, and especially if you don't have any home accessible to you in any other place. But again, this is not tax advice. This is definitely more subjective territory, which makes this more subjective tax residency criteria quite annoying. Only potential exemption available is this one, where it says foreigners who have become domestic tax subjects will only be taxed on Indonesian sourced income. However, it is only available if you have a certificate issued by a government authorized institution or have a minimum of 5 years work experience in the field of science, technology, and math, and you have an obligation of knowledge transfer to an Indonesian citizen. This would mean that you would not be taxed on foreign income for the first 4 years of residency. So if you have this particular case where you're going to get this obligation for knowledge transfer, you could be exempt from foreign income, but still any work performed in Indonesia would be taxable. So in most cases, you're not going to be able to benefit from this. But just to be fully clean and just to be completely safe, what I would do is first of all, not get a residence permit in Indonesia. Use one of their shorter term visas, like their 6-month digital nomad visa or one of those other ones that are clearly not a residence permit, not a KITAS, and make sure you have a tax residence somewhere else where you clearly have more ties than you do in Indonesia. For me, UAE works extremely well as this tax residence because this is very easy to set up there. I can have my banking, my finances, my business there, and then use that as my main base and my tax home to then spend time around the world, where as long as I don't have any more ties to any other country, I can live fully legally tax-free around the world. If you're interested in getting set up in the UAE, this is very easy. I have a team where we help people do this. We will help more than 300 people get set up in the UAE, and the entire setup can be completed in as little as 1 week. If you're interested in that, you can book a free call with my team from the first link down below in the description. And of course, it's not the right choice for everyone. I'm not saying you have to live tax-free, but just understand that if you want to live in Bali, especially for more than 6 months, there's very little you can do to actually optimize your taxes, and then you need to decide whether you're fine with that or not. So that is the situation. If you want to understand what are the different visa options in Bali, if you want to relocate to Bali, whether part-time or full-time, you can watch this video right here. So watch that video next, and I'll see you in the next one.